Welcome to the second session of the history stream we're doing. We are doing Josephus, the Great Revolt and the Birth of Christianity, and we're very lucky to have Dolan Cummings speaking to us about that. Dolan's is an Associate Fellow of the Institute of Ideas, having been Research and Editorial Director from 2001 to 2010. He's part of the committee that programs the annual Battle of Ideas Festival. He's a regular participant at the festival and other IOI events, and has a particular interest in religion. Dolan is also one of the co-founders of the Manifesto Club, which is a campaign group for freedom in everyday life. He's developed the Roundtable Rumbles, theatre debates. He has edited the IOI's online review Culture Wars. He has published 2 collections of essays, The Changing Role of the Public Intellectual and the Debating Humanism. You should have these pulled up. Yeah. Okay. And he's also one of the organisers of the Debating Matters India, and I do like his Facebook entries with great interest and a little bit of envy, shall we say, coming from India whenever they go along there. It's fascinating. Professionally, he's now a freelance copywriter and editor and speechwriter, and as I say, he's going to speak to us about Josephus.
Okay, I'm not sure if this is exactly what anyone's expecting. Some of the readings I've put out for this were quite hard going. If you try to go through them. But it's, I'm not coming to this as an authority on Josephus by any means, but what I want to do is look into the history and going some way back to try and develop an idea of where Christianity comes from, what it has in common with Judaism. And then hopefully we'll have plenty to discuss. Okay. Evangelical Christians sometimes like to sum up human history in what they call the 3 C's. Creation, catastrophe, Christ. Creation very much speaks for itself. Catastrophe refers really to the fall of man when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit and brought sin into the world, eventually leading to the flood and various other disasters. So Christians read the Old Testament as working out that catastrophe. They also see hints of salvation to come. Particularly in the Psalms and prophetic books like Isaiah and Daniel, Christians see foreshadowings of Christ as a redeemer not only of the Jews but of all mankind. So the New Testament casts Christ, God himself, as an actual figure of human history that saves mankind. And history since then is really an extended epilogue. Because whatever happens now, we know what happens in the end. The salvation is already done. The Jewish reading of the Old Testament is, of course, very different. Of course, you have creation and catastrophe, but as yet no Christ. So as far as Jews are concerned, after the creation and fall, pretty much everything since has been a catastrophe. That's Jewish history. Moments of success or happiness only really serve to underline a disaster when they come crashing down. In the period we're discussing today, or we'll get to eventually, hopes and expectations of a Messiah also feature very heavily. So that eschatology, questions of how things end up much more of a political issue than they ever have been in the Christian world. There are some in the American religious right who look at Daniel's political manual, but that's fairly marginal. The idea of looking out for the Messiah was far more crucial to Jewish politics at the time of the revolt. Now, our main source of information about the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 AD and the religious politics that drove it is Josephus, who was, of course, also an active participant. Now, as you know, there's a great deal of controversy about whether he's entirely reliable. He's a participant who was kind of covering his back when he wrote about the history of the war. He's describing his own role in responding to his critics. So there's, of course, reason to be skeptical. Is he making stuff up, trying to make himself look good? But however critically we read him, he is a very valuable source, and I think an intriguing figure in his own right. I'm going to come back at the end, and in terms of the morality of the situation, I think the question we're talking about, whether he was a traitor, traitor to the Jewish cause, simply a pragmatist, or perhaps even neither. In terms of history writing, Josephus runs the gamut from first-person narrative, as in his account of the Jewish war, to really plundering the archives. And his Jewish antiquities he tells the story of the Jewish people really from the beginning of time. So let me read the opening of book 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. But when the earth did not come into sight, but was covered with thick darkness, and the wind moved upon its surface, God commanded that there should be light. I'll stop there because you probably recognize that this is a shockingly blatant example of plagiarism, straight out of Genesis. But I think what that points to is that the fact that for the Jews of the ancient world, history was more or less inextricable from Scripture. It wasn't that you had a secular history and then a religious. So although from a modern perspective it might seem unscientific, really I think the point to take is that the Jews had a unique respect for the written word and a unique sense of their own history in the ancient world. Paul Johnson says it in his History of the Jews, which is very readable if you want to follow up. The Jews developed the power to write terse and dramatic historical narrative half a millennium before the Greeks. And because they constantly added to their historical records, they developed a deep sense of historical perspective, which the Greeks never attained. So sorry, Josie, the Jews are better than the Greeks. To get a sense of perspective, I want to give a selected recap of that history. I'm going to take a long run up before we get anywhere near the Jewish war. So, in the beginning, God created. Yeah, I worked it out. Okay. Distinctly Jewish history does begin in the realms of legend rather than secular history, but maybe around 2000 BC with Abraham. So the legend has it Abraham was chosen by God to father a great nation. And skipping on a bit, I'm not going to go too much in depth. Abraham's grandson Jacob literally wrestles with God. Now this is quite an odd and obscure piece of scripture, but it does seem that God appears in human form and wrestles with Jacob. Jacob puts up a good fight, and God's impressed. He seems to be happy that Jacob has put up a tough fight. So he renews the covenant with Abraham. It says, I was Abraham's God, I am your God. And he renames Jacob Israel, which means he strives with God for wrestling. And then, so Jacob's 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Those 12 sons, most of you will remember from Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat. But for the rest of the history, I think the important point is that the people of Israel metaphorically wrestle and strive with God. That's Jewish history in a nutshell. They're named Israel because of what Jacob does, and that's what the Jews continue to do. And the narrative now jumps some generations. The Israelites settle in Egypt and flourish as a people, provoking the jealousy of the Pharaoh, who enslaves, again skipping on some time. And Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt. But they don't go straight to the promised land because they're ungrateful and faithless and constantly moan about everything. You read Exodus in some detail. So they wander in the wilderness for 40 years, during which they also lumber with the Ten Commandments. Even Moses is disobedient, so God punishes him by not letting him into the promised land when they do get there. And Joshua leads the invasion. Invasion because actually the promised land is already inhabited by Canaanites. This is part of the Bible some people get a bit squeamish about because it's a little bit genocidal. Basically, they have to go in there and drive out the existing inhabitants, stamp out every trace of their religion. But they settle in, try to live according to God's commandments, but they fail frequently. I mean, they're not fighting the natives, they're fraternizing with them and worshipping their pagan gods, and their God is not too pleased about it. At this time, the Israelites are ruled by local judges. There is no king. These judges do their best to keep them in line. The various stories about this: Samson, Deborah, Gideon, Samuel are the famous judges. But as the people struggle to fend off various enemies, they're constantly under siege in Canaan. And they struggle to keep themselves united. So they begin to want a king. Other nations have kings, they say, why can't we have a king? There's other historical evidence. We can roughly place this around the 11th century BC. Now, the last judge, Samuel, was asked to find a king. Samuel became, some of the judges were quite local figures. So Samuel became a national figure. He was very much respected as a prophet, really, as much as a judge. But he says, we can't have a king, that's blasphemy. You know, we're ruled by God. You can't set up a human being to rule over us. And indeed, he consults God, according to the scriptures, and God is really furious about this whole situation because the Hebrews have been very badly behaved and now they want some other authority over them. And he says, fine, let them have what they want, Samuel. But just warn them, if they do raise up a king, They'll take all their stuff, get their sons killed in war, and generally be a bastard. But the people insist they want a king. So Samuel selects Saul to be the first king of the Israelites, and guess what? He turned out to be a bastard. He does tax them very heavily, the rewards when people get killed. But again, our descriptions, God is merciful, so he makes sure they get a good king eventually. And King David is really the kind of thing that the Israelites had in mind all along. He's very famous, wise, achieves a lot, gains a lot of wealth, but he's also quite sinful, especially towards the end, so he's no saint. He's followed by King Solomon, who's also pretty good. Again, a flawed character, but he does build the temple in Jerusalem, which is a massive achievement, and seeks to establish the Israelites in the land. But after that, things take a turn for the worse again. The succession after Solomon is divided, and effectively the kingdom is divided in two. You have two separate kingdoms, the 10 northern tribes in what's called Israel, and the two southern, in the south called Judah, which is where Jerusalem is. And over the years, there are a few good kings in each kingdom, but for the most part, it is one lousy bastard after another in both Israel and Judah. Consequently, in about 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel is conquered by the Assyrians, and the Israelites are lost or assimilated, more or less wiped out. Judah survives, and there's a couple of well-behaved kings, Hezekiah and Josiah, and they try to restore proper religion and to go back to the commandments and the laws. But it doesn't last long. In 597 BC, Judah too is conquered by the Chaldeans, or Neo-Babylonians, under Nebuchadnezzar, and he destroys the temple. Unfortunately, the Babylonians are somewhat less ruthless than the Assyrians, so they don't wipe out the Israelites, and they let people survive as part of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But in a series of waves, they take the Jewish elite into exile in Babylonia, where they settle and multiply. So this is a period known as the Babylonian captivity. The peasants are left behind, but the elite, and maybe it kind of describes the middle class, if you can use that term, are taken to Babylonia. And there's great anguish about this. This psalm relating to this period asks, "Now how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?" If you don't recognize it from the psalm, you might recognize it from Boney M. But surprisingly, the answer turns out to be quite well, because the Babylonian captivity is actually the golden age for the Israelites. And in fact, there is a good case that this is the period when Judaism is established in a recognizable form, and really becomes meaningful to talk about Jewishness. It's paradoxical. It's not when they have their own kingdom, but actually when they're in captivity under the Babylonians, that you start to develop something that we can recognize as Judaism. Now, partly because they're deprived of the temple, they don't have the temple as a focus of worship. So religion necessarily focuses on the Torah, the law, and the Old Testament books supposedly written by Moses. And this is now studied in the synagogues and increasingly understood by ordinary Jews. So it's not just confined to temple priests. But the synagogue, it's almost described as a more democratic form of worship. It's not centralized, it's decentralized. People take an interest and read. And there's a great literary culture within Judaism at this period. Josephus later explains in a book called Contra Appian, which is a defense of Judaism from a critic, Appian. And so he says, "Should any one of our nation be asked about our laws, he will repeat this as readily as his own name. The result of our thorough education in our laws from the very dawn of intelligence is that they are engraved on our souls." So this is the idea that Jews as a kind of uniquely literary people who take the law very seriously and who study. Again, not having a centralized temple, they just have to study it themselves. Also, not only deprived of a temple, they're deprived of a state of any kind. The Israelites, we can now call Jews, they bound themselves together as a people by submitting voluntarily to the law. So that they're under the power of Babylon. The Babylonians aren't telling them they've got to follow the Jewish law. It's their own determination to stay Jewish, to keep themselves as a distinct people. And so it's at this time institutions like circumcision, which was always there going back to Moses, but it starts to be practiced much more widely and seen as important because it distinguishes the Jews from the others around them in Babylonia. Also, the Sabbath is maintained more rigorously to distinguish, again, from the people around them. Paradoxically, it was actually Babylonian science that enabled the Jews to systematize the religious calendar. The Babylonians could do calendars in a way that the Jews before that hadn't really understood. So they could observe holidays much more fastidiously. And even the Hebrew script was taken at this period from the Babylonians. This is also a period in which ideas become much more prominent in Judaism. The migration of souls, there wasn't really anything about the afterlife in the Israelite religion up to this point. It's possibly in fact taken from Babylonian religion. And it's quite likely that an important part of the book of Isaiah, which is traditionally held to be in the 8th century, was actually written in the Babylonian captivity, sometimes called Deutero-Isaiah, the second bit. In that book, we find an explicit universalism, a stress on the individual as a bearer of faith, not just tribe or nation, and the idea that it's individual souls who are accountable for themselves. This is a century before Socrates, or if it really is, Isaiah really is the author, actually 3 centuries before Socrates. But I think it's quite important, it's a development of an understanding of humanity in a way that you might not expect in that part of the world at that time. There's also much more satisfactory monotheism that emerges in Isaiah. If you read the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, it sometimes seems that Yahweh is not really denying the existence of other gods. It's just saying that he is better than that. So he's just kind of, but he says, you'll have no other gods before me, saying, well, what gods? You almost have a sense that there are these kind of gods running around, and Yahweh's just the best one trying to make himself come out on top. In Isaiah, instead, you have God saying, I am the first and I am the last, besides me there is no God. Much more explicit idea that there is only one God. And implicit in the idea of only one God is that it's not just actually, although he's a covenant with the Jewish people, he's also the God of everyone else. He created the whole world, he created everyone in it. And so that's a kind of a universal idea which is lacking in other religions. So there's a good case that the Jewish religion was really forged not in Israel, but in Babylon. But when that empire was conquered by the Persians, just half a century into the captivity, the Jews were allowed by the victorious King Cyrus the Great to return to the Promised Land. This is about 538 BC. And he even got some permission to build a temple. So of course, Judah remains part of the empire, and now Persian empire, having been taken up from the Babylonians. The following century, 5th century, the Jewish leader Ezra called an assembly, Knesset, which is still the name used by the Jewish parliament. And that was a kind of legislature under the Persian government. So it wasn't a challenge to Persian authority, but it did allow the Jews to administer their own affairs to some extent. And this is at the point where the new Judaism is kind of institutionalized within Judah. The Hebrew Bible is officially canonized. It's like which books are in there and which are not. And there's some tension between the returning aristocratic professionals and the peasants who are having been left behind for a generation or two, would have dropped their religious responsibilities, really. So there's some tension there. But basically, this arrangement survived until the Persian Empire in turn was conquered by Alexander the Great around 332 BC. Alexander the Great didn't stick around long, died of heavy drinking probably. After his death, his empire was divided between his generals. First a series of Ptolemies and a series of Seleucids. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt, the Seleucids ruled Syria, and Palestine was right in the middle. So they kind of tussled over who had that control of that. But these are very much so-called Hellenic dynasties, so they're part of the Greek world. And so that's where the political power now is. But this period also saw the growing dominance of Hellenic culture throughout the region, throughout the East Mediterranean. And many Jews became Hellenized, adopting Greek names, reading Greek philosophy, and really leaving behind some of the elements of the Jewish tradition. Under Ptolemy II in the 3rd century BC, 70 Jewish scholars translated the Bible into Greek, giving us the so-called Septuagint, which is an important legacy. It shows that, as well as the Hebrews taking from the Greeks to some extent were interested in learning from what they could from the Jews and from Jewish history. As this suggests, Judaism was largely tolerated by the Ptolemies until the 4th of the series, who persecuted the Jews and tried to defile the temple. And then when the Seleucids took over, things were even worse. But things were really brought to a head by the rise of a new power in the West, the Roman Empire. Rome defeated Philip V of Macedon and the Seleucid king Antiochus III, and that really destabilized the whole region. And Antiochus was ruling over Judah at the time, but he had to pay a heavy tribute to Rome, which meant that he looted temples of various cults throughout the empire, including the temple in Jerusalem, because it was a huge source of wealth that he was able to get plunder to get to the Romans. Things got even worse under his son Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means the illustrious one, but he was soon known to the Jews as Antiochus Epimanes, the madman. Partly because he defiled the temple, he took prostitutes into the temple as a deliberate affront. He sacrificed a pig to Zeus in the temple, just to wind up the Jews. Worse than that, perhaps, he'd already effectively sold the high priesthood to Hellenized Jews, first Jason and then Menelaus, who really did his bidding. He saw the high priesthood not as a religious thing, but basically that's the leader of the Jews, and so I want to control who's the leader of this people within my empire. But it should be noted that there was a deeper tension between the Greeks and Hellenizing Jews, and then the rigorists who wanted to keep Jewish culture pure and distinct. And this is almost a defining feature of the period leading up to the Revolt. There are Greek cities, Caesarea in Judea, and there are whole areas that are populated by Greeks, but also by Jews who have become effectively Greek. And then there are other Jews who insist on remaining separate. It's interesting that the separation of the Jews was particularly offensive to Greek sensibilities. The Babylonians didn't seem to mind that the Greeks kept themselves apart, had rituals that meant that they were different, considered others to be unclean, wouldn't eat with anyone else, and so on. But the Greeks really objected to this, because unlike the Babylonians or the Persians, the Greeks saw themselves at the vanguard of a universal human culture. So the separateness of the Jews, they saw as being misanthropic. Why would you want to cut yourself off and not mix with our great civilization? So Antiochus Epiphanes called the Jews inimical to humanity. And did fairly extensive persecutions of the Jews. So this persecution provoked resistance from the Maccabees. The Maccabees were a guerrilla army formed by Mattathias Hasmonean, who was a devout priest, he killed a Jew who he'd seen about to sacrifice to a Greek idol. So killed him. Then he had to flee to the mountains. And he took his sons with him. He had 5 sons. And they basically built a guerrilla army, a very successful guerrilla campaign against the Seleucid rulers. Eventually they were able to win Jerusalem, control of Jerusalem. And the Seleucid rulers, who had their own problems, they were fighting also in Syria. There were all kinds of rebellions going on. So they decided to grant religious freedom to the Jews, to tolerate their separateness. And the Hasmonean brothers took on the high priesthood for themselves. Again, strictly speaking, they shouldn't have done because they weren't Levites, and according to Jewish tradition, the high priest had to be Levite. But they took that on, they took on civil governorship, still under the empire. But then in 142 BC, the Seleucid king Demetrius II granted Judea political independence. By this stage, though, it was actually the Roman Senate who had to rubber stamp this decision because they controlled the whole region. But technically, the Hasmonean government was the first autonomous Jewish state since the Babylonian conquest 500 years before. So again, we're back to having Jews in control of themselves, autonomy, a political entity, and not just a religion. But of course, autonomy at the behest of Rome was never going to last long. In fact, lasted just a mere century, really. The Hasmonean dynasty actually kind of resembled the worst of the pre-exilic kings before the Babylonian conquest, all those terrible kings I was talking about. So the history of that period is almost like a continuation of the Old Testament history. the Jewish kingdoms being badly ruled, falling away from true religion, and generally things going badly. The Hasmoneans did, however, expand aggressively. They wanted to have a territory, a political territory, so they forced neighbouring nations and tribes to convert to Judaism, or they were killed. Again, this isn't something which is often associated with Judaism. But they had violated the tradition that they shouldn't be high priests. And despite having come to power in opposition to Hellenization, they actually adopted Greek customs and names themselves. So the later Hasmonean kings are called John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus. And in fact, Josephus reports that many Judeans complained to the Romans that the Hasmoneans were basically behaving like absolute monarchs, even though they were supposed to be kind of priestly. The Hasmoneans also squabbled among themselves as the rival brothers vied for power. So when the Romans stepped in and finally made Judea a client state, ending the independence, many Jews actually welcomed that intervention. And under Rome, the relatively successful kingship of Herod the Great, yes, that bad Herod, but who actually, again, achieved a reasonable amount under Roman sponsorship. That the ongoing tension between the Hellenizing Jews and the rigorists had been heightened during the Hasmonean period by the persecution of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were so-called Hasidic rigorists who very much wanted to keep Judaism and the Jews separate. And although they supported the Hasmoneans at first against the Seleucid Empire, when they began to behave as Hellenized Jews, when they began to betray that kind of national aspiration, the Pharisees turned on them and were persecuted as a result. So under Herod, back to Herod, religious life continued to be characterized by tensions between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a more conservative and aristocratic sect. They were suspicious of Jewish nationalism, basically because they were more elitist. They claimed ancestry from the brother of Moses, Aaron, and they were very much focused on the temple rather than the synagogues. The Pharisees were more out in the synagogues, teaching, more popular, whereas the Sadducees were focused on the temple. Interestingly, the Sadducees also rejected the idea of an afterlife, that legacy of the Babylonian captivity. So they kind of go back to pre-Babylonian exile in the sense of their understanding of authority, their understanding of what Judaism was. Other sects decided by Josephus include the Essenes, who left Jerusalem in disgust at Hellenization and lived in the wilderness. These are probably the people responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. But they had, on one hand, they were more rigorous. They wanted the Jews to be separate and were disgusted by Hellenization. But they also had, they're sometimes described as kind of proto-Christian in the sense that they were more interested in the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. Other groups, the Zealots and Sicarii, who were something between extreme nationalists and criminal bandits. Now again, this is going back to Josephus being slightly unreliable. He portrayed them pretty much as criminal bandits because he disagreed with them politically. And maybe that's a slightly unfair characterization. But the ongoing tension between Hellenization and Jewish rigorism was not the only tension that mattered at the time. Because not all Hellenizers were religious. Those who wanted to speak Greek and read Greek philosophy weren't necessarily turning their backs on Judaism. And at the same time, not all rigorists were Jewish nationalists. There were those who wanted to maintain the idea of the Jews being very separate, but we didn't want political a nation state or anything like that. Another way of thinking is exemplified by Philo of Alexandria, sometimes known as the Jewish Plato. Philo drew on Greek philosophy while remaining true, at least in his own terms, to Judaism, the Jewish tradition. But he saw Judaism not just as the religion of a particular ethnic group, but as a coherent and universal ethical system. And again, this draws on some of the more universalizing tendencies that happened during the Babylonian captivity. But he believed that the Jews could essentially be priests to humanity. They could serve that role for the whole world. But even in Philo's thought, the divide between Jew and non-Jew was unbridgeable. And this is a fundamental issue with Judaism. there were in fact non-Jews in Jerusalem and elsewhere who identified as God-fearers, who looked to the Jewish Torah and laws, but they weren't Jews. And even though they sacrificed in the temple, they did all these things, but they just weren't Jews, and that was a fundamental category. So Roman Judea remains divided between the Jews and the Greeks. The Greek just means anyone else. It might be something definitely Jewish, but that's just a general term. Herod the Great died in about 4 BC, and religious and also class divisions led to widespread riots and challenge to Roman rule. And the rebellion was put down with 2,000 rebels crucified by the Romans. The country was then divided. They cut Galilee off and they merged Judah into another kingdom under their control. And there was violent resistance to this, also to taxes. The big issue was tax, although arguably it wasn't really an economic thing so much as a cultural thing. The fact that the Jews were forced to pay tax to the Romans was an affront culturally, religiously, as much as economically. So we're getting closer to the revolt now. In 14 AD, the Emperor Tiberius caused outrage by raiding the temple to pay for an aqueduct. Again, it's just a ready source of cash. So he wants to build an aqueduct. He takes stuff out of the temple. In 37 AD, his successor Caligula actually made a donation to the temple. Unfortunately, that donation was a statue of himself as Jews, which didn't go down too well with the Jews. So the Jews at this time were increasingly putting their hopes in a Messiah, and that would be a descendant of King David, who would release them from Rome and restore Jewish pride. And there's elements in here in the scriptures pointing towards a Messiah. And anyone who's seen Life of Brian or anything slightly more highbrow than that will get the sense that there are all kinds of figures popping up, false messiahs here and there, all kinds of people claiming to be the Messiah. And there was a lot of agitation, people getting excited about one or turning on another, and so on. But this is a case of eschatology coming into ordinary politics. There was a moment of slightly more mundane hope under the Emperor Claudius, when a Jewish king, Herod Agrippa, was allowed to rule. And he championed Jewish interests, but he also generously funded the Greek towns. So there was, perhaps hope of reconciliation, and maybe we can all get along. But he died in 44 AD, probably murdered. And in the following decades, tensions increased between the Jews and the Greeks. The stage is set for revolt by this stage. So in 64 AD, the Emperor Nero replaced the governor Albinus with the rabidly anti-Jewish Gaius Florus, who encouraged anti-Jewish riots throughout Judea, and actually provoked an uprising in Jerusalem. And as a result, the uprising was successful, and the Jewish leaders there installed an independent Jewish government. And that was kind of the beginning of the revolt, which spread throughout the country. In Galilee, the revolt was led by a certain Joseph ben Matthias, better known to us as Flavius Josephus. To cut a long story short, I'm not going to go into the military history in any detail at all. We can talk about that if you like. The revolt was suppressed brutally. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD, once and for all, and that was the end. And there was another revolt in 131 AD, but it's kind of an afterthought. So from this stage, the temple was done. Importantly, Josephus failed to defend Galilee, possibly through incompetence, possibly because he wasn't really interested in defending Galilee. And he mysteriously survived the resulting suicide pact. Everyone was all rolled up and decided to kill themselves, and Josephus kind of snuck out at the end. The details of that, again, are just speaking. Probably should take what he has to say about himself with a pinch of salt. He then switched sides and worked with the Romans, and he was more or less adopted by the Flavian generals, the father and son Vespasian and Titus, who both went on to be emperors. And so, he adopted their name. That's where Flavius comes from. He went to Rome, where he did a lot of his writing, and basically became a Roman figure, writing in Latin or even Greek. Understandably, he was reviled by the Jews as a traitor. Someone not only who had failed to defend Galilee, but who then had helped the Romans, and then who was writing propaganda. And they saw it was very one-sided, really was an attempt to vindicate himself, to clear up the Romans, and really taking his own side against the Jews. But I think, although it's understandable he was seen as a traitor, if you look back at the history I've talked about, I think a case can be made that he was not only pragmatically right, the revolt was never going to succeed, it was a disaster, it provoked the destruction of the temple, but he even stood within an authentic Jewish tradition of passive acquiescence to worldly power and trust in God. So if you look at the way that the Jews have understood their own history, the high points were when they were ruled by someone else, as long as they had enough autonomy to practice the religion. And attempts to form political states had always ended badly. That kind of political independence was arguably un-Jewish. I mean, obviously there's an argument within Judaism over that. But I think certainly there is you can make a case of tradition there, and that Josephus stands in it. You know, even if he was less than valiant in the way that it all came out. So an even more famous figure who stood in the same tradition before being nailed to a cross. Jesus Christ is very much in the tradition of passive acquiescence to worldly power and trust in God. Christianity, of course, began as a Jewish sect, and although Jesus consistently frustrated the Jewish expectations of a political Messiah, you know, people would say, oh, so you're the Messiah, you've come to liberate us from the Romans, and he'd say, no, not really. He kept running away from crowds if you read the Gospels. He was very reluctant to stoke up any expectations that he had a political role of any kind. Now naturally, it was after the death and reported resurrection of Jesus, Christianity really becomes a significant idea. Crucially, finally, Christianity makes no distinction between Jew and Greek or anyone else. But it was firmly rooted in Jewish history. The Jewish history of the Jews striving with God, going back to the legend of Jacob. In the Acts of the Apostles, the early church deacon Stephen, who was himself a Jew, he rails against the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin. A number of Jews believe in Jesus, believe Jesus is God. That's the ethics of it. Yeah, you could say Jesus is in the Essene tradition, actually probably more of a Pharisee, even though he gave the Pharisees a hard time. But he's in the more kind of democratic, spirit not letter of the law tradition, which is very much Jewish. And a lot of people could accept that. The stumbling block was the insistence that he was actually God. But this is the arguments made. So Stephen is in the Sanhedrin with the leaders of the Jews, and he gives them a long speech, in fact, where he goes back and talks about the whole of Jewish history, kind of like Pakistan. But he concludes with shouting at them, "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. You who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it." Unsurprisingly, Stephen was promptly taken out and stoned to death, becoming the first Christian martyr. But even from a Jewish perspective, he kind of had a point. If you look back over Jewish history, it's a history of the Jews resisting God, struggling against God, trying to have things their own way rather than doing what they're told. And that had been internalized by a whole strand within Judaism, who felt that this is something that they had to learn from, to move on from. And the point of this isn't that the Jews were a uniquely sinful people. In Christian thought, the Jews striving with God really stands out for humanity as a whole. The disobedience, the sinfulness of all human beings. We continue to disappoint and frustrate God. But in Christianity, we're forgiven because of Jesus' sacrifice on our behalf. And that means in Christianity, the universalism implicit in Judaism is finally realized. And in a sense, the agenda of the Jewish Hellenizers is achieved. Finally, the Judaism can be part of the polis in the form of Christianity, but open to everyone. But it does remain an important difference between Christian universalism and Greek universalism. And this goes back to what Joseph was talking about yesterday, really, and the idea of morality. The Apostle Paul was in many ways the author of Christianity as a doctrine, much more so than Jesus. He took from Judaism ideas of repentance and atonement. I mean, the core of Christianity is from Judaism. But also the idea that real freedom means freedom from sin. That a freedom of a clear conscience and a sense of rightness with God. So it is this attachment to a monotheistic God, which is just not there in Greek thought at all. The idea that there is a transcendent morality, a rightness, which meant that, from the perspective of the revolt, national liberation was never an end in itself. Just ruling yourself is not the point. If you could live under an empire and are allowed to maintain the correct laws and live a godly life, that's fine. You only need to resist to the extent that you're prevented from doing that. And that's essentially the kernel of Christianity, which gives it a complicated relationship with authority. So very slowly it spreads throughout the Roman Empire, appealing first to diaspora Jews, and the Apostle Paul and others travel throughout the Mediterranean. They always go first to the synagogue and they talk to the Jews in Greek cities, in Turkey, and Rome itself. But then they bring it out to others as well, and they open it up, that up. And it's a slow process, obviously, went after the initial apostles. And again, cutting a long story short, the paradox is that eventually this doctrine of acquiescence to power becomes the official doctrine of the Roman Empire. And I'm not going to talk about that, but maybe we can just discuss afterwards. There is some question. I mean, there are Christians who argue that the Roman adoption of Christianity was a disaster for Christianity, because it became about worldly power rather than being resistant. And there's a case for that. Interesting even to look at the foundation of the church with popes and so on, which is, you could have that without being part of a secular power. How much authority there is for that in the tradition I've described. Is it that it comes out of that Jewish tradition, or is actually the idea of the papacy more of a Greek or Roman idea? Just to give a rough indication, there's a famous passage in the Gospel of Matthew, which is often pointed to as the reason for having popes, the authority of the pope, where Jesus is asking the disciples who he is, and Peter answers that he's the Messiah, and he says, well, yeah, you obviously got that from God, because I didn't tell you. And he says, I tell you, you are Peter, Peter meaning Greek for rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So there you go. He's kind of named Peter as the first pope, the keys to heaven that you see in all the Western art for centuries afterwards. And that's the idea that the Petrine monarchy almost of the church. But what happens next is very interesting. Immediately after Jesus says this, he announces his intention to go to Jerusalem and prophesies that he'll be arrested and killed. And Peter's really shocked by this, and he actually takes Jesus aside and says, well, you're wrong, this is impossible. And to this Jesus replies, get behind me, Satan, you are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on things of God, but on things of man. So from Pope to Antichrist in about 4 verses. And that's an indication of the ambiguity about authority that exists in Christianity from the very beginning. And the great paradox beyond the Roman Empire becoming Christian is something we've talked about at the Academy in many years in the past. That tension between secular and spiritual authority, which was really brought into the whole of European history for the following 1,000 years. But I think you can trace that ambiguity all the way back to the Jews. And the Jewish revolt is a kind of example of a road not taken. Judaism, after the fall of the temple, was never the same again. Arguably, just as Christianity was created after that period, so was Judaism as we know it now. Obviously drawing on certain traditions. But yeah, so I'll just end with that question. Was Josephus a bastard for selling out his people? Or was he doing the right thing? Or even more than just pragmatically the right thing, and was he actually morally in the right?
Right, I've got some microphones here, and sadly we've got no minions to sort of distribute the notes to, so I'm going to put one on each side, and if you can pass us, that's why I asked for you all to stay up towards the front. We've got one question here, and if you don't mind taking that just until somebody on that side wants to speak. And I've got one more. So, go ahead, yes.
Yeah, it's trying to understand the continuity in the fact of Jews over time, and I've never looked at Judaism this early before. I've become a bit more familiar with it later on in the Middle Ages. But so, can you say really that what they do is will themselves into being a biological fact? Because that seems, the way you've told that story is that they, through the strength of the idea of separatism and distinctiveness and being the chosen people, they basically create themselves as a kind of generation to generation biological. I don't they don't exist objectively as a biological subspecies, but the idea of them is of being this distinct people. But the fact of their continuity seems to be something that kind of there doesn't seem to be a break in it. And but obviously there's these schisms, and so who is it that is the continuous group, if you see what I mean? When other people are being Hellenized, or that's what I've never quite understood is who is it that kind of continues down the line? Why don't they just all dissipate? And what's the strength of them as a people? When I say them, that sounds really dodgy.
Yes,
right,
it depends how you refer to them, really. Them. Yes. And handily, you have the microphone.
Okay, bit louder than I expected. In the portrayal of the revolt, Josephus, I think, says that basically the Jewish tribes destroyed each other, and then the Romans came in and finished them off. And the destruction of the various different sects is painted as kind of inexplicable. They just seem to be doing it for almost frivolous reasons. And I just wonder if that's an example of Josephus not quite telling us the truth. Is there more to it than that?
Okay. And in front of you, please. Can you make sure that one's on? Because I'm not sure. There's a green light on.
It was, it's not anymore.
Oh, right. You turn it on with a little red
light on the bottom.
Yes, you push that, and then the green light should come. Sorry about that.
And you talked about when they were in Babylon in captivity, the kind of how the calendar helped them recognise certain festivals and things like that. I was just wondering if there's in modern Judaism, if there's aspects that you think reflect Roman rule or Greek influences, kind of specifics within current practice within Judaism that reflect the influences of those different cultures.
Okay, we'll take a couple more. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Take a couple more, and then we'll come back.
Well, just to answer your final question, Dolan, I don't think he sold out in the way that you're trying to ensnare people into. I'm always impressed in history as to how change happens before it happens. If you read, I think it's Peter Ackroyd's first volume of the History of Britain, what I find quite remarkable is that Britain was basically Danish before the Anglo-Saxons came. It was Roman before the Roman invasion. It was Norman before the Norman invasion. We know even more recently that the trade unions collapsed from within before Thatcher administered the coup de grace. So, I think Josephus was a man of his times, and at that time, the Jews were not.
Okay, and you?
The Jewish people being known as the people of the book, it coincides that the Babylonian exile, immediately after Ezra came back with the compiled Torah from the Babylonian exile. So the book was edited at that time and was physically in the hand of Ezra and the people. Also, the Mishnah coincides to be the book that was compiled after the revolt, especially after the second revolt. Meaning, during the at the absence of the temple, people feel the need to compile the written tradition of Judaism in order to have something that will sustain the Jewish culture for the posterity. So I am not comfortable with the portrayal of Josephus as a morally compromised, let's say, trader, perhaps we should see him as a visionary, as somebody who took as a pragmatic person who took the opportunity to defect to the other side in order to be favored by Vespasian and have the opportunity to write down the history of his people, so to leave a legacy for the future generations, not just as an opportunist who meant to save his neck and have the comfort of his lifetime.
Okay, we'll bring back Dolan.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with that analysis. Certainly,
I should get a microphone for you. Sorry about that. I'll have to have a microphone up here. Thank you. Those minions are helpful, aren't they?
yeah, I agree with that, particularly the fact that Josephus' writing history was very much within the Jewish tradition. And I mean, Paul Johnson's point is that the Jews take literature and written history more seriously than anyone else. So there's something characteristically Jewish about that at the time. Also, I mean, the point about the empire, the Roman Empire was, it didn't take religion particularly seriously. It had a degree of toleration. You can't really take pagan Romans' religion seriously because it's just daft, isn't it? I mean, so it doesn't have that kind of moral seriousness that you have in Judaism. And so, yes, the empire was potentially fertile ground for Judaism as much as it was for Christianity. And the thing to do perhaps was to look for compromises rather than revolt. I think, the idea that the sects destroyed each other, partly it was the paradox of just trying to be separate, but to be based on ideas, on text, because it never was biological. There always was cross-fertilization, literally as well as intellectually, which was, in the Old Testament, in the Pentateuch, it's very much frowned on the idea that they should fraternize with anyone else, but inevitably this happened, and people were incorporated into Judaism. I did put in the readings a review of Shlomo Sand's book, where he talks about the invention of the Jewish people. It's quite contentious because it's tied up with the whole question of Zionism today. But he argues, in fact, that modern Jews are derived from someone completely different and have nothing to do with ancient Israel. In a sense, it doesn't matter because it is this is Simon Shamma's response, it is a cultural tradition rather than a biological legacy. And that's fine, and most Jews are quite comfortable with that. So yeah, it's the biology doesn't really go away because Jews want, if you want to maintain Judaism, then you have to maintain certain marriage restrictions and so on. But I think taking a grander historical sweep, it's much more fluid than that. As for other influences after Babylon, I think inevitably there have been some, but the whole drive of Judaism has been to resist that, to try to keep to something ancient. But if you take, if you think of modern Hasidic Jews, whether the Yiddish language obviously doesn't go back to biblical times, the costumes go back to a particular period of European history. Theologically, though, I think it has managed to stay fairly rigid. There's obviously divisions within Judaism, Reform and Orthodox, but the point is that the intention has always been to remain separate and not to be influenced by other cultures. So it's kind of happened accidentally, and there's always been a resistance to it.
Okay, at the back.
Hi, thanks. I'm curious about the kind of theological dimension of the temple. So, as far as I understand it, the temple is an institution. If there's no cult for Judaism, then you're not in favour with God. But from what you've seemed to have argued, acquiescence within kind of Hellenization or secular culture is preferable. And I was wondering to what extent is there a tension there?
Sorry, can you explain the first part?
Yeah, so from what I understand, I may be wrong, but from what I've understood from studies, if you've got no temple within Judaism, you you can't perform the kind of the sacrificial cult and the rituals. So you're not in favour with your God. Just wondering.
Okay.
Stuart?
Just for my own benefit, could you explain what this session is about in the context of morality? Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. Okay, and Piers?
Thanks. Sometimes you find Christian apologists pointing to Josephus as a source who tried to authenticate Christ. I mean, do you share the general understanding that the passages in Josephus that refer to Jesus, which I think some people think are one of the only two pagan references to, or non-Christian references to Jesus, are actually interpolations by later Christian writers? Because it is sometimes used as a kind of apologetic because of the obvious suspicious fact that almost all the references to Jesus are from Christian sources, yet here we have a non-Christian source that's supposed to authenticate certain aspects of his life.
Okay, and
yeah, just a response partly to Bill's earlier point. I mean, I think you were kind of tempting us a bit by calling Josephus a traitor, but I don't think Bill's right to say that he was a man before his time, because I don't think he was really a traitor or consciously wanted to lead a revolt. He was very much a reluctant leader of a revolt and was pushed into that position by the loss of Galilee and a lot of the internal divisions within the Jewish people. So it might be useful also for you to say a bit more about that, the extent to which that undermined his position. And when we get to the kind of the suicide pact as well, I think the point is well made that I don't want to get into the suicide issue too much because I know we're talking about that in a separate context later. But the point was made that sometimes it's worth dying for a cause, and at that moment it wasn't worth dying for a cause. There was nothing to be gained from it. So I'm not sure whether that kind of added to his legacy. But of course, if he had died, it wouldn't have been written up. So we wouldn't have known about it. He was the only person who had a decent source about the revolt. But I wonder if you could say a bit more about some of the internal divisions, particularly as a result of his failure to defend Galilee, and to what extent that was significant in the problems with the revolt.
Okay. Yeah.
On post-temple Judaism, I mean, basically since the destruction of the temple, there is no temple, so there are no temple sacrifices. And so since then, Judaism has been based in the synagogue, and there is no sacrifice. So the temple was about animal sacrifices. The two things that have happened in terms of that, first, the Jews now have a focus purely on the law and the study of the law, which is separate from that. The idea is simply that period is finished. So you can't be a good Jew without sacrificing at the temple because there is no temple. And there is, in a sense, always an ambiguity about whether the temple is a good thing or not. I mean, it doesn't look very pagan. And in fact, even the Romans said it was barbaric because they were slaughtering all these animals and there's blood everywhere. As Jesus says in the Gospels, that you don't worship in a temple; it's out there with the people. And actually, that's not a revolutionary break from Judaism. So it's within that, in the Babylonian captivity, you have the development of a religion which is away from the temple. So the fact that they wanted to rebuild it was perhaps part of a nationalist aspiration rather than a return to religion. So you can certainly make a case that the temple doesn't matter in that kind of way. On the other hand, of course, Christianity is based on the sacrifice of Jesus, which is directly analogous to the sacrifices made in the temple. So you've got that kind of pagan element which is being sublimated into Christianity. The interpolation into Josephus, yeah, probably quite likely. There are certain passages that I don't happen to hand that are pointed to. Josephus has always been popular with Christian scholars, I mean, as you say, perhaps because they can say, look, this guy's not a Christian and he's backing us up. So probably, again, not entirely reliable, not his fault, but because of the way that it's been passed on. As for the morality, I'm not trying to shoehorn it too heavily in. The question of whether Josephus was right or wrong is one moral question. But I think through the history of Judaism, it does have a very different idea of morality than we see in Greek thought, which is much more to do with supplication, to giving in to faith, doing as you're told, much more than trying to figure things out for yourself. Which doesn't say there's not a rational element within it, but there's certainly a fundamental idea that actually, and Peter's a great example. Peter, who's the best of the apostles, and then he denies Jesus 3 times, as well as rebuking him. Basically, human beings always get things wrong, so unless you're with God, you don't have immorality. I think that's a core idea that has been incorporated into Western civilization through Judaism and Christianity, and always existed in tension with the more rational views that you can work out what's the right thing to do. So there's just, I think, an important element there. In terms of the divisions around Josephus himself, I mean, there were various different leaders going on. There was never a kind of unified revolt with, Revolt HQ and Central Command. So that obviously made it difficult because you're up against an empire which does have Central Command. And it was very slow and drawn out, as one Constantine. We're talking about AD 70. Actually, they were mopping up operations for years after that because, just some guy living in the hills, launching guerrilla raids. So there wasn't a military cohesion there, or political, and I think that's probably a reflection of the fact that there wasn't a religious one either. The question, when we say the Jewish revolt, the interesting question is, who are the Jews to be revolting? And they define themselves at that time mostly as the non-Hellenizing Jews. There's also the point that the Marxist writer Ibn Liam makes, which is actually there's a very strong class element, and the revolt is as much against the rich Jew, and sometimes Hellenized Jew means rich Jew to some extent. There's definitely that element, but if you're going to have a Marxist revolution, AD 70 is probably a bit premature. So again, that wasn't going to happen. It would have been a pragmatic thing, would have been some kind of accommodation. But yeah, that's... Was there anything else?
No, I'm going to talk about something else. But I think it's a very interesting question that you asked, Stuart. For me, I think one of the interesting elements of this whole discussion is sort of the genealogy of our morals. How do we get our moral positions today? And I think that's what's quite useful about this particular discussion of Josephus. I'll call it from now on, since I've been pronouncing it Josephus. But it's apparently Josephus. I'll take Piers as being the authoritative on pronunciations. No? We're all guessing. Well, in Canada we say it Josephus, okay? Don't diss my culture, okay? So I think the key thing is we're looking at the creation of a couple of things. With a monotheistic God, you have an overarching morality. With polytheistic gods, you can choose. There's no morality that necessarily goes towards this community or that particular, their morals are different than ours. There's no conception that you can have a moral community with anybody outside your immediate community. And I think what Dolan's described is this whole ascent towards a sort of universal morality that, as you point out, didn't really reach it until Christianity, when you had that, when you had a true universal morality. It's kind of like if you read the morality in Plato's The Republic, it's very, very, the community is all. Community was the basis for morals, whereas you have this sort of transcendent idea that there can be something above all of us that unites all of us as humans, and that we should all aspire to, and it's that universal God. I'd be fascinated if you could say anything about Zoroastrianism, because I always thought that was the first monotheistic religion, and I wonder how influenced Judaism was by that through some of the element aspects. Just two other things. I always think with these historical judgments that it's a bit, you know, we're always judging in our own terms historical events that happened a very long time ago. I think, for my money, Josephus is important as a recorder of events, much more than judging the particular actions that were happening. Yes, and it's absolutely necessary to have the perspective that this is being recorded by somebody with very much a stake in the way that it's recorded, yes, but at the same time judging that person. Or I always think that the class element is also very sort of anachronistic. You can't really read classes back in with any kind of meaning to 2,000 years ago. But more questions? Yes, at the very back.
I agree with your last point, and I think like Thucydides, we can look at Josephus to explain and describe many of the things that happened in a historic context, but recognise not all of it might be accurate in the scientific way some people may want, although even those notions of history have changed over time. I want to come back, because I think, Kevin, you made some really good points about what, you know, to Stuart's question, how is this relevant to morality, but just a bit more perhaps around it, because I think the thing about, in your introduction, you kept mentioning, I think the thing about writing things down and being banished, and Kenan talks a bit about it in his book as well, when at different points, the experience of the Jews when they're being banished and the way they perceive their God, and how that's introduced a punishing God versus a loving God, and through that experience of writing things down, and then writing those things down and studying them, and then the idea of one universal God and how that's played through as a foundation for monotheism, and then what leads on to what we understand through Christianity and the idea of universal ideas. I mean, we've talked about in the past the fact that when, during the Reformation and the Bible, people for the first time really, the people begin to learn to read. And through that learning to read, to become educated, and that opening up a window for more enlightened possibilities of transforming the world through everyone being educated. But actually, this was a precursor in many ways to that, even though you had the rabbi, the teacher, writing things down and recording ideas of where we come from and how we should behave, what is to be done, how should we live, what is the right way to live, and everything. Just a second point, you mentioned Abraham Leon. I think in terms of Jane's question, I think that actually, maybe controversially, Leon was right on this point. The Jews probably would have been assimilated in different circumstances as it happens. It was, to the point about Yiddish Orthodox people, it was only really the backward nature of some parts of capitalism that enshrined the role of the Jew in very particular circumstances, rather than the more Western, perhaps, assimilated, that became incorporated in more developed society. But I mean, obviously, that's a slightly controversial point.
Right, thank you. Yes, over here. Where's the nearest microphone? Oh, there, good.
Dolan, two questions. First of all, when you were talking about the early history of the Jews, you said they were ruled by judges and that they didn't have a king. I'm just wondering if you could say a bit more about the different qualities that rule by judge would look like as compared to rule by a king. I mean, we don't normally think of judges as ruling over us, and to me the thought is rather horrifying. But I'm just wondering, what is the significance of the distinction that you've been drawing there? The second point is that Josie was talking yesterday about Socrates' attitude to the rule of law, when he was given the opportunity to escape the judgment of the law. And he said, no, I can't do that, I mustn't do that, because if I cheat the law, then I'll bring about the destruction of the state. That's a bit of a simplification, but that was the thrust of it. And it seems to me that's been the dominant view that Western civilization has had of the rule of law ever since, a sort of Hellenic view, if you like. And I'm wondering if that is to be contrasted with what you might describe as a Jewish or Hebrew approach to the rule of law, which is that actually you must always follow your conscience, follow your God or follow your conscience. And I suppose there is a sense to which that has also been adopted into Western approaches to law, but very much as an exception to the rule. I just wonder if you could comment on that as well.
Okay, and Sabina? Oh, okay. And you next, okay.
I remember reading Olivier Roy, who's not on the reading list, and he makes an interesting point about Judaism. He says there was actually quite a lot of proselytizing, so missionizing. And you made that interesting point about the universalism of Jewish religion by having one God, but there seems to be a little gap there. You know, it might be a universalist idea to have the same God, but at the same time, these were the chosen people. So perhaps that would fill, you know, the fact that there was actually some proselytizing going on. I was just going to ask, do you know about that? And that might fill that gap, and would then be an important point to make, also in relation to the biological question.
Okay, and
I wonder if you could say a bit more, Dolan, about where the figure of Jesus sits in the Great Revolt, because I'm not sure anymore the extent to what he's a radical figure. I mean, is he just a really good Jew? There's this sort of idea that's popular these days of saying, well, Jesus never really went around saying, I am God. He's being a lot more nuanced about that, and it was Paul that comes along and says he's the Son of God and so on. But I mean, what actually gets him nailed to the cross? Because he goes before the Romans, and the Pilate says to him, so you claim to be God then, do you? And Jesus doesn't say, yes, absolutely. So what's going on there?
Yeah, good question. Like Eminem, he says, I am whatever you say I am. But I think, the point is Jesus deliberately frustrated political expectations. I mean, if we believe the Gospels, whenever a crowd gets stirred up, he takes off across the Galilee, or disappeared, and it always makes the point that he's not come to overturn. And so the famous render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God what is God, which kind of goes back to this question about conscience, that it's within certain limitations. If it matters, then you have to stick with it. But it's the idea that you say, no, we're Jews, we must have an independence. It must take a political form, I think is very un-Christian. But there's also the interesting point that when I forget which of the Gospels, when Jesus talks to the Pharisees, and he says, who is the Messiah? And he's the son of David, and he quotes the Psalms where David is saying, actually the Messiah is Lord. So it's not, he's saying, I'm not the son of David, I'm better than that, I'm Lord of David. Better than that as far as he was concerned, but it wasn't the Messiah that they wanted. They wanted a military ruler, a leader. So I think Jesus has very little to do with the Jewish revolt. It's a very different strand that he wasn't really engaged with. Anyway, it's all to do with the kind of end of times thinking as well. If you focused on the afterlife, and my kingdom is not of this world, then you're not really worried about politics in the sense of who governs Judea. So I think I would distinguish it. He's very much separate from that. The question about judges, obviously the name is probably misleading. I think the best way to understand it is judges in the sense of people who tell you that you're in the wrong. Because there's a constant sense of the misbehaving Israelites having to be disciplined. So kind of moral arbiters rather than rulers. So the judges didn't have a kind of sovereignty in the way that a king does. That was the difference, and that was one of the reasons it was difficult for the Israelites to stick together. They were divided amongst themselves as well as being under attack, which is why they wanted a king. So it was very much about, again, anti-politics, just focus on morality, living godly lives. To go back to the point about proselytizing, I know the Hasmonean dynasty was particularly keen on that. There'll be others I'm less familiar with. But there's always been, again, going back to the period when Jewish history is really legend, the idea is that you're in a completely fallen world. It's full of people worshipping pagan gods, everyone's really, really sinful, you mustn't get involved with them. Don't mix with non-Jews. So the idea was the only way to be godly was to remain pure and separate. It's just a whole principle of separation. We're over here with our rules. We're not going to get involved. Everything's going to get terribly wrong if we intermarry with other tribes and so on. So that's the kind of orally thing, which is part of the kind of Jewish instinct in a sense. But obviously there have been times when, more confidently, when Israel was a more political entity, then it could be more proselytizing, and that universal aspect could come out. But I think the idea was just kind of being in terror of straying from the true path, which makes proselytizing a difficult thing to do. Even if you have absolute faith that it's one universal God who belongs to everyone, if he tells you to separate, you have to separate. And that's kind of become an instinctive element of Jewish culture throughout. I don't know anything about Zoroastrianism, I'm afraid.
Yes, Joseph.
Could you just answer your own question of whether he was a traitor or not? I mean, you seem to be saying that, in a way, the experience of worldly disappointment was productive for the development of Jewish spirituality. So the inability to transform in this world means a spiritual development of the other world, and that becomes, which you can also see in certain philosophies, sort of around that time in terms of Stoicism and things like that, transcendence in the other realm, not in this realm. So is that what you're saying? You're saying that the kind of experience of disappointment and failure was actually quite productive, and therefore that he did the right thing, realising it wasn't where it was at. Secondly, it's the thing that's striking me about what you're talking about in terms of a kind of idea of morality, just how starkly that contrasts with the sort of thing we were talking about yesterday. From a kind of a purely cerebral individual process to an idea of a feeling of the universal, so the feeling of God, and the fact the individual, their kind of supplication to God being the moral experience. So just almost like a kind of direct opposite in many ways, but probably is an element of truth. So it's all about the heart and not the head, and the supplication of the individual and not the assertion. So maybe just, is that right or not?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Yes. Jesus did occasionally give the odd straight answer to a question. He did once say, "I am the Son of Man."
Yes.
You call that straight answer?
One thing, there's a couple of things that have come up that I think are kind of interesting. First of all, the question about conscience and following one's individual conscience, I think that's very specific to our time. I think that's post-Kantian, and to sort of look back on that in history, I don't think that's what was meant by conscience. This reflects on what you were saying as well, Josie, is that I don't think there was an individual morality. I'm going to go with whatever I feel that predated that. And I think it's important to say that that's a very specific idea to our time and not to classical times. There was no conception that there was a sort of I will follow my conscience and all the rest of you are damned. It was much more the reflection of what the community, what the interest of the community should do. So I think Judaism is an advance on that in the sense that it's universal. It's saying that all human beings can follow our God, and that our God is God of all human beings. As other people pointed out, there's a sort of missing step in that then how do you join, how does everybody else join into this? And my first wife attempted to convert to Judaism, and it's not an easy process to do so. And so mikveh tanks and all sorts of other things where people, it's a very, very difficult thing. So I think in that sense, Christianity as a proselytizing religion is a sort of advance on that in creating this universal morality that everybody should aspire to. The other interesting thing about Christianity is the whole, and I can't remember where I heard this, but forgiveness. Because forgiveness as a sort of moral good did not exist, did not pre-exist Christianity. And so Christ, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do, turn the other cheek. These things didn't exist in the Old Testament. It's, of course, an eye for an eye. And so this, these are where our moral concepts come from. And I think Dolan's done an excellent job in sort of showing where that's come from. Any last questions? Because I'm going to bring... Oh, right. Okay. Yes.
Andy there. Dolan, I enjoyed your talk. Josephus was a bit like Socrates. He was a critique of his people. The birth of Judaism, Moses was the father of Judaism. He came out of Egypt and went into exile. But Moses was the product of he was an unfavored son. Moses invented God. He invented the moral law. It was based on the resentment of the unfavored brother. In order to get back at his real unfavoring father and to get back at his more favored brother. So it's resentment. Now, Josephus, by the time of Josephus, he criticized the way that his brothers were behaving. But he was a wide guy, Josephus. Unlike Socrates, he didn't commit suicide, but he made sure his mates committed suicide. And then he got favour with, I don't know the guy who was going to become, was it Vespasian? Or he had voices in his head telling that Vespasius was going to end up emperor of Rome. And he idles up to Vespasius and tells him this was going to happen. And of course, he became emperor of Rome. And then Josephus then reneged on his brothers. But his criticism of his Jewish brothers was they'd reached a stage in history when God, there were no longer the favoured race. God was passing them over for these upstart Christians. And ever since Josephus, the Jewish race have been in exile. They had nowhere to go. And then there was the Holocaust. Presumably that was God telling them. It wasn't Hitler who killed them all. That was God. He wanted to tell them, okay, you're not going to. And then, now with the existence of Israel, we're back to the beginning again. God now favours the Israelis over their Arab brothers, their Abrahamic brothers, Semitic brothers. But similarly, Christianity is based in morality, is based on resentment. Natural morality, we're empathetic chimpanzees. Natural morality is based on empathy and sympathy.
I'll have Dolan come back in and finish off in 3 minutes.
Yep. There was an important rabbi called Hillel who possibly taught Jesus, who was supposed to have said when asked about the law that don't treat other people as you wouldn't want to be treated. That's the whole of it. The rest is commentary, go and study it. That was a slight oversimplification of Judaism, really. And similarly, Jesus himself at one stage quotes the golden rule, do unto others as you have done to you. Didn't take Jesus to dream that up. It was being, discovered by the Greeks, or formulated by the Greeks before. So that's not really unique. What is more, in the New Testament, when Jesus starts to talk about, he quotes the Old Testament saying, "Love your neighbour," and adds to that, "Love your enemy." That's the kind of extreme new ethical idea that comes in, which is very much the development on the idea of forgiveness. But I think it does have its roots in really putting God above any human concern. So that's the idea is that God wants you to forgive, so you have to forgive. So you don't come to a rational decision that it's the right thing to do. You have to love other people just because they're also created by God. So there's like, you can't really take God out of either Christianity or Judaism. You can't extract an ethical kernel that doesn't have something to do with God. It's just pointless. That doesn't mean that we can't look to the universalism, the peculiar aspects of transcendence. It's all a bit woolly, but there's certainly elements of it we can get to, and obviously contemporary ethics, to a large extent, draws on Christian without being itself Christian. So that makes an interesting question to what extent that could be done. On the question of whether Josephus was a traitor, I mean, obviously he was a traitor to the cause that he joined. He joined up to say we're going to fight the Romans. He let down his comrades. He switched sides. I think the bigger question is whether he was right to join the cause in the first place, because he articulates the case that it was a mistake. And he's not the only one, but makes a strong case. And I think it's a credible case. He's not just making it up to cover himself. You can say actually, and drawing on Jewish tradition as well, that actually acquiescing to the empire, working within the empire, was not an un-Christian or even an un-Jewish thing to do. So yeah, a traitor in national terms certainly. The point is, Judaism is never really quite national. I won't get on to Israel because I think it's quite relevant. But the idea of an ethical kernel which is separate from loyalties that you might have to other people around you, you might have to betray people around you to do the right thing, I think is very much a tradition that stands in.
Right, thank you very much.